Hello, everyone. It's really great to be speaking with you today at the Harvard Symposium and taking a bit of a deep dive into the challenges that we all face as a society in terms of keeping our children safe in the digital world we all now inhabit. Parents, schools, governments, and of course, our faith-based institutions all have a significant role to play in not only making sure our children feel happy, healthy, supported, and protected in the real world, but also ensuring that the same level of care and protection in the online world too. The World Day for Child Sexual Abuse Prevention, Healing, and Justice is an important day to acknowledge the terrible abuse suffered by children every day around the world. But it also represents a unique opportunity for the world to come together and discuss some practical strategies and solutions to help prevent it. As Australia's online safety regulator, the protection of children online is my primary focus, and I'd like to share with you some of the insights and lessons we've learned in the 6 years we've been in existence. But first, let's take a quick look about what eSafety is all about. Created in 2015, eSafety is the first government online safety regulator in the world whose sole purpose is the protection of its citizens online. As the first regulator, there was no playbook for preventing online harms, so we've had to fill in the pages as we've gone along. We now believe we have a successful and practical model that focuses on 3 key areas: protection, prevention, and proactive and systemic change. And it's the protection part where I'd really like to begin, because our regulatory schemes represent the tip of the spear in our fight to protect vulnerable children online. eSafety has a range of civil powers to compel the takedown of illegal or harmful content, whether it's child sexual abuse material, pro-terrorist content, image-based abuse, or the non-consensual sharing of intimate images, and the serious cyberbullying of a child. But I think it's fair to say that our priority as an agency, and the bulk of the work that we do, is focused on the removal of child sexual abuse material and disrupting the networks who trade in it. This really important job falls to our cyber report team, who are tasked with viewing some of the worst aspects of humanity online. And of course, some of the most distressing content involves child sexual abuse material. Material that presents the torture and abuse of innocent children for sexual gratification and sometimes for profit. And sadly, my investigators are busier than ever. 2020 was a year like no other, and one I think most of us would probably rather forget. The COVID-19 pandemic saw the internet become an essential utility as the whole world turned to it to continue to work, learn, communicate, and be entertained. As more of us began inhabiting the online world and fueled by fear, uncertainty, and doubt, online harms became supercharged in ways we weren't entirely prepared for. And in Australia, we saw spikes across all of our reporting areas. During 2020, our cyber report team received 21,000 public reports out of a population of 26 million. The majority of these reports involved child sexual abuse material. This was the most in the scheme's 20-year history and a 90% increase compared to what we saw in 2019. We also saw a 114% increase in reports of image-based abuse, or the non-consensual sharing of intimate images, and 30% of those reports were of those under the age of 18. Serious cyberbullying of children also increased by 30%, and the number of Australian adults reporting online harassment to us increased by nearly 40%. We believe that the elevated levels of online harm and abuse we're seeing represent an alarming new normal, especially in the fight against the spread of child sexual abuse material. According to the Global Threat Assessment 2019 from the We Protect Global Alliance, at any given moment, there are an estimated 750,000 individuals online across the globe looking to connect with children for sexual purposes. Statistics show us that 5% of the male population in any given country has a sexual interest in a child. Further, our recent report on the digital lives of Australian teenagers found that 1 in 3 teens had been contacted by a stranger online. That's up from 1 in 4 just 3 years ago. I think we all agree that this represents a really worrying escalation. Along with the elevated levels of online abuse we have seen over the past year, we've also seen some worrying new trends in how children are being exploited and abused online. Our investigators are seeing higher volumes of coerced child sexual abuse material where 6 or 7-year-old children have been manipulated or intimidated into performing sex acts for the camera on iPhones or iPads in the privacy of their bedrooms and bathrooms. In a number of these cases, we can hear the voices of their parents, unaware, in the next room. We've also started to see examples of something called capping, where predators groom online children on platforms like FaceTime or Skype, encouraging them to take off their clothes while the predator screen captures it. These predators then use that picture to further extort the child for content, threatening to share with family or friends if they don't pose for other pictures or perform more explicit sexual acts. This form of abuse sometimes even escalates to physical meetings and contact offending. We're also seeing more examples of child-on-child harmful sexual behaviors, where children are forcing other children into performing sex acts. And while child sexual abuse material has been traditionally traded in the dark web, in the early months of the pandemic, our cyber report team noted a 650% increase in reports related to the sharing of CSAM out in the open on Facebook and Instagram. In July 2020, eSafety and the Canadian Centre for Child Protection, or C3P, collaborated in an investigation to explore the extent to which CSAM was being shared on Twitter. We found that more than 156,000 accounts sharing CSAM, again, out in the open. And we're also seeing the intersectional nature of different forms of online abuse. 30% of our image-based abuse reports involve victims under the age of 18. And once this has been confirmed, this content is reclassified as child sexual abuse material. We're also seeing more examples of forms of sextortion among children reporting to our cyberbullying team. Now, I know I've painted a fairly scary picture there, but I want to now turn to how we are addressing this, and this brings us to the important work we do around prevention. Our primary goal at eSafety is to prevent online harms we see every day from happening in the first place. We're striving to achieve this through evidence-based research, education resources, and community programs that are designed to target specific audiences, giving people of all ages and backgrounds the right tools to protect themselves online. We believe that this is a lifelong educational journey that should begin in the home as early as possible, because we know that 94% of 4-year-olds in Australia have access to an internet-connected device, 42% by the age of 2. I'm sure we'd all agree, regardless of your nationality or religion, that's pretty early. And that's why for all of us, it begins with our Early Years program, which reinforces the guiding principles for young children: to be safe, to be kind, to be curious, and to ask for help if something goes wrong online. Schools, of course, have a big role to play here too. While still an important cornerstone of education, the world has moved on from the traditional 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic. We must now teach the 4 R's of the digital age: respect, resilience, responsibility, and critical reasoning skills. Today's kids face challenges many of their parents never experienced, like the pressures of social media, online bullying, dealing with unwanted messages or contact from strangers, pressures to engage in sexting, or just having to decide what news is real and what is fake. We know that fear-based messages don't work, so we need to be reinforcing these important lessons in a positive, pragmatic, and non-threatening way. We also need to reinforce similar messages to parents to be more aware of the dangers without being alarmed. A key piece of advice we tell parents is to be present and to take an active interest in their children's online lives, just as they do in their everyday lives. As parents, we're really good at asking our kids how their day was at school or if they scored any goals at soccer, but we're not so good at asking them about what's going on online. And that needs to become part of the standard dinner table conversation. Our eSafety Guide was created to help parents demystify the online world that has now become such a huge part of their children's lives. And because it's online, All of these materials are available to anyone, anywhere, at any time at esafety.gov.au. But the responsibility for online safety cannot continue to fall solely on the shoulders of children and their often overwhelmed parents. And this is where proactive and systemic change comes in. We've all known the harms for over 2 decades, and the tech companies are also well aware of how their platforms have been weaponized. So it is truly time for these companies to take responsibility for how they are being used to harm children. So how do we change the future? At eSafety, we believe the answer lies in something we call safety by design. And this is largely because the online world we inhabit now wasn't built for safety. It was built for speed. Few guardrails have been erected on these digital roadways, and no virtual seatbelts have been deployed to prevent our children from reaching the darkest recesses of the web. When we get into our cars, we almost take for granted that the brakes will work and that the airbags will deploy. We trust the protections built into our cars, guided by international standards, will keep us safer on the road, because safety is built in by design. Shouldn't we expect the same standards of technology companies as we and our children navigate the internet? We believe they absolutely should. We've spent the last 3 years working with big tech to lead them down a path that will fundamentally change how they design, develop, and deploy their products, with safety at the core. Later this month, we'll be deploying free interactive assessment tools for companies of all sizes and maturity so that they can assess and mitigate their safety risks. We can then provide them best practice guidance, and we can begin to lift the safety standards across the tech industry. A tech wreck moment does not need to be inevitable. And while we all know the internet is global, the laws governing it remain local. And I do fear that we run the risk of creating a splinter net as governments and industry take disparate approaches to online safety. There is a continuing but necessary tension between a range of fundamental rights that need to be rebalanced and possibly be recalibrated, whether it's the right to privacy with the right to child dignity, or the right to data protection versus the right to be free from online violence. 2 key examples exemplify this tension. While the move by industry to end-to-end encryption is one clear and present threat to our ability to combat the trade in child sexual abuse material, we've also seen that with the European Union's application of its new e-privacy directive, this has also resulted in a backward step in this fight against child sexual abuse. Under this directive, Facebook has already stopped scanning for child sexual abuse material on its platform in Europe. The result has been startling. A 50% drop in reports from Facebook to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in just over 6 weeks. And it doesn't pretend well for the time that Facebook goes dark by end-to-end encrypting its Messenger product. Because the trade in child sexual abuse material knows no borders and no bounds, this is why our international partnerships are more important than ever in helping us to identify victims and disrupt the trade in this distressing material. As a member of InHope, the global network of 47 hotlines located in 43 countries dedicated to combating online child sexual abuse material, we are able to facilitate rapid takedown of content and law enforcement action where appropriate. In 2019, the InHope network received almost 184,000 reports about online child sexual abuse material, with 92% of the victims under the age of 13. eSafety is the Australian hotline in the InHope network, and we're also one of the only hotlines in the world with a solid government regulatory scheme behind us. We're also a member of the Child Dignity Alliance and the We Protect Global Alliance, which includes 100 countries and 70 companies committed to making significant steps towards the eradication of child sexual exploitation. And while these international partnerships are vital, the world needs to go further, with countries adopting a coordinated approach across sectors, across borders, and transcending language, culture, and faith. After 6 years of online safety experience and regulation, we now actually deal with very little CSAM that is hosted in Australia. In fact, we are almost exclusively dealing with content that is hosted overseas. While this shows that our efforts are having a real impact on our own shores, when it comes to more permissive online hosting environments overseas, our actions are limited by sovereignty and jurisdiction. But things are definitely changing. Ireland has announced the establishment of its own online safety commissioner, and Fiji has already established theirs. And we've had a number of conversations with Canada and the UK about setting up their own national online safety regulators. We certainly hope that the US and others join us too, and the global network we hope to build of like-minded agencies. I suspect that in the next 5 to 10 years, we will see an international network of online safety regulators working together to close the circle on those who trade and profit from this distressing material. I want to thank you so much for listening and for allowing me to tell you a little bit about eSafety, our multi-layered approach to protecting children online, and our vision for creating lasting change from within industry and internationally through a unified approach to tackling this intractable problem. As a global community, I think we would all agree that the fundamental human rights of children should transcend all cultures, borders, and religions. It's incredible to think that the vast majority of the world's population follows some form of organized religion. So engaging faith communities on these important issues is absolutely vital. While governments around the world must of course do more, we also need to do more in our parishes, in our temples, in our synagogues, and in our mosques to create institutions that don't shield predators, but instead empower and encourage victims to report and speak out. You can't hope to fix a problem unless you are first willing to acknowledge that you have one. And we know that abuse thrives on silence, and that silence encourages pain to fester. By continuing to come together like we are today to openly discuss the problem of the exploitation and abuse of children, both online and in the physical world, it is my sincere belief that together we will also find a lasting solution. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lisa Thompson. I'm Vice President and Director of the Research Institute for the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be a part of this incredible event and to be a part of these conversations on preventing child sexual abuse. Let me pull up my presentation to share with you, and we'll get started. I'd like to begin by suggesting that to actually prevent child sexual abuse, we must recognize the role of adult hardcore pornography in fueling child sexual abuse and exploitation. In fact, we have an expression in English called the elephant in the room. And for those of you who may not be native English speakers, when we use this phrase, we're talking about something that's very big, very obvious, right in front of our faces, but we don't want to talk about it. And that's precisely what is happening when it comes to the role of adult pornography in fueling child sexual abuse. But I'm here to share with you just why we must wrestle with this issue. So let's dive in. I'd like to begin by sharing with you that there are 45 studies that have found negative brain changes among pornography users since 2009. And these studies have assessed pornography's influence on brain structure and function and found negative impacts. These studies actually support the premise that pornography can cause addiction-related brain changes. Now, how might this happen? Well, the source goes back to something called natural rewards. Scientists have a name for things humans are wired to find necessary for our survival: natural rewards. And near the top of this natural reward list is something that the internet provides in unlimited supply, and that's sex. And by sex, I'm referring to hardcore adult pornography. Now you have this coupled with the internet's endless supply of novel sexual imagery, and we have a potent source of unlimited natural reward. You may have wondered why there seems to be so much internet pornography. It's like there's an ocean of it. Well, it's because we have that natural sexual desire for sexual reward, and then we can find this limitless supply of novel imagery. These things are going together. So novelty and desensitization, what are these two things and how are they connected? Well, compulsive pornography users have been experimentally demonstrated to prefer novel sexual material. And just to be clear, when I'm talking about novel sexual material, I'm talking about something that is new, something that is different than what you've seen before. Now, novel sexual stimuli is compelling because it helps trigger the release of dopamine in areas of the brain that are associated with reward. Now, what can happen is over time, because a person has used something a lot, they become habituated and desensitized to it. And this is actually a common feature of addiction. So if we're talking about behavioral addictions or substance addictions, people have to end up using more or different kinds of those materials in order to get the same level of pleasure. Well, the very same thing is happening with pornography use. This leads to something called escalation. And I'll just give you an example from a study to explain what I mean. A study of self-identified motivations of child pornography offenders, who are people who were convicted for viewing child pornography, child sexual abuse material, reported a progression from adult material to child sexual abuse material. Now, these child pornography offenders reported initial exposure to child sexual abuse material as an accident or something that they sought out of curiosity after viewing adult pornography. But after prolonged exposure and desensitization to the legal pornography, these child pornography offenders reported escalation, how they moved to the child sexual abuse material, and reported developing a sexual interest in children based on their increased exposure to the material. And an additional example of this, and there are others besides, I'm just giving you a couple here to demonstrate how this overexposure to pornography is going to lead some individuals to need to escalate to different content. So this study looked at the images that were contained on the hard drives of individuals who were convicted for possessing child sexual abuse material. And they evaluated the images on these people's computers. They evaluated the images based on the age of the children that were being depicted and the severity of the acts that they depicted. They found that over time, 37.5% of the collections exhibited increased severity in both the age and the extremes of what was shown. So in other words, the children became younger and the acts became more extreme. So this is evidence of habituation to the content, to low severity content. They had to escalate to more extremes in order to get the same level of pleasure. They also noted that all of the CSAM collections included adult content. So this would suggest that those who are becoming involved, that a lot of people who are becoming involved in CSAM are not initially pedophiles to begin with. Other studies have looked at the role of age and the role that the age of first exposure to pornography plays in desensitization. This particular study investigated whether so-called deviant pornography, and by that they meant either child or animal pornography. They were looking at that and whether or not it got worse based on the age at what a person first began looking at pornography. They surveyed 630 subjects and found that individuals who engaged in adult pornography use at a younger age were more likely to transition into deviant pornography use, demonstrating desensitization to adult hardcore pornography over time. So this is significant because we know that so many young people today, people who have electronic devices, who are internet connected, are exposed to pornography at a young age. So many of these devices don't have filters. Parents aren't equipped to help children, activate filters, or don't even know that this problem exists. And yet we're giving these children access to basically like walking them into a XXX store and saying, here's your phone, have, we're just not protecting them sufficiently. And this is so important because, as the study suggests, the younger they're exposed, the more likely they are to be desensitized to the content and to escalate to material like child sexual abuse material. Another really important factor in considering the importance of adult pornography, it normalizes paraphilias and extreme sex. So I'm talking about depictions of sex with persons who look like children, depictions of sex with animated characters which look like children, pornographic depictions of cartoon movie characters and video game characters that are popular with children, scenarios portraying incest. This is one of the main themes of mainstream pornography today, is the normalization of incest. Sex with animals, excretory activities, and violence against women, slapping, gagging, choking, assaults, rape, sex trafficking, and torture. These are all very identifiable themes in mainstream adult pornography today. And the more people are consuming this and exposed to it, the more that it is normalized and the more that individuals become desensitized to it. And this is particularly concerning when we're talking about children being exposed to the content. Another reason we should be concerned about adult pornography is the way that some adults use it. Some adults use it to actually groom children for child sexual abuse. That can be in terms of educating them into the mechanics of sexual behavior, encouraging children to reenact the behaviors, exciting children sexually, and actually initiating children into sexual contact with adults or with other children. So adult pornography is essentially a grooming medium that predators use to abuse children. Now, what I'd like to point out is that given the fact that we have so much exposure to pornography today via the internet and children not being protected from that access to adult content, the culture, these social media and all the hypersexualized content out there and the pornography that they can easily access is serving as a super groomer. The children are, some children are emulating the sexualized media content that they see, the social media influencers who are acting out in hypersexualized and pornified ways. And then children are actually self-producing and sharing their own self-created pornography. That's how the culture is serving as a super groomer. And that because the culture itself has taken on the ethos of adult hardcore pornography. So where does this lead us? Well, I have the misfortune of introducing you to Belle Delphine. Now, she became famous as an Instagram model, and her Instagram account was full of images in which she's portraying herself as in a very childlike way, but also very sexually provocative way. That was the whole point of her account, was to basically sell herself, present herself in these highly sexualized images, but as a child. And her Instagram account was full of images and messages that actually normalized child sexual abuse. And you can actually see from the image here on the right, like in this particular example, she's actually wearing a shirt that says, "Come here, daddy," a very clear innuendo and like normalizing incest, right? Well, the reason why I'm bringing her up to you is because Belle Delphine at the moment is the highest earning pornography performer in the world. She has shifted from selling sexualized images to actually now producing hardcore content. And just this happened just in the last couple of months, as a matter of fact. Her first hardcore film, she has sex with a man. The man is dressed as a teddy bear, and they're on the bed with children's toys. The man remains disguised throughout the episode by leaving the teddy bear mascot on his head. So again, she's dressed as a prepubescent child, and essentially it's a visual representation of sexual intercourse with a child rape, with a man dressed as a children's toy. That was her first film. Her second film, she is dressed in the clothes of an adolescent girl. A man kidnaps her, drives her into the woods where she is depicted being raped against a tree. So how is this? This is the most popular, high-earning pornography performer in the world. And I would suggest to you that the entire reason why she is so popular is because she is portraying herself as a child. She is playing into the desires and fantasies of so many pornography users, the appetites that they have cultivated. She also uses ties in other pornography genres, but her principal success is because she's presenting herself as a child. And then in addition, so I raise that to just to share with you the state of modern pornography, right? That when we have a scenario where in adult hardcore pornography, the most famous world performer is someone who presents herself as a child. That is the state of modern hardcore adult pornography. Now, another issue I wanted to raise very quickly was child-on-child harmful sexual behavior. We believe this is a very underrepresented issue, and that pornography is playing a very large role in fueling it. There are studies that have shown that youth who are intentionally exposed to pornographic material were nearly 6 times more likely than those who were not to report having engaged in sexually aggressive behavior. So ultimately, what I wanted to suggest to you and share with you is that child sexual abuse and exploitation are being, actually not are being, they have been mainstreamed. They are part of the modern pornography. It's part and parcel of modern pornography. And let me give you an example. So some of you may be familiar with the company MindGeek. It's the shadowy corporation that owns Pornhub. Pornhub is one of the most famous pornography tube sites in the world. MindGeek also owns other exploitive sites. And for years, MindGeek has built its business model on monetizing massive amounts of unverified user-generated content that has included images of sex trafficking victims, of CSAM content, of non-consensually distributed pornography, as well as all other kinds of racist, rape, and other exploitive content. Now, finally, after stories of survivors, of individuals who have been had sex trafficking victims with their content shared on Pornhub, young girls who's had their sexual assaults, their rapes filmed and uploaded to Pornhub. Their stories are coming out. And this has resulted finally in an investigation that's being led by the Canadian Parliament. Their ethics committee is looking into MindGeek at long last. But this just goes to show how mainstream this kind of content has been. Pornhub has been one of the world's most popular pornography tube sites, and yet this content has been in plain sight for a decade and nobody has done anything. So we're excited about the movement to investigate them, but this is just the tip of a very big iceberg, because there's many other pornography tube sites that do the very same thing. So if you're interested in learning more about this, we invite you to join us in April for a briefing that we're having on this topic. So ultimately, the summation I have here is that child sexual abuse material, child sexual abuse, this is not a dark web issue. People who care about ending sex trafficking and child sexual abuse and exploitation must care about mainstream adult sites. And if you're interested in learning more about pornography, its harmful effects, and Pornhub, I invite you to visit our website, insexualexploitation.org. And we also list in here some of the hashtags we commonly use. And finally, we warmly welcome all of you to participate in our Coalition to End Sexual Exploitation Summit, which will be happening in July of this year. So thank you again so much for this opportunity to share, and I hope you'll join with me in working to stop the normalization of child sexual abuse through adult hardcore pornography. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ian Drennan. I am the Executive Director of the We Protect Global Alliance, and I'm here to speak to you about digital safety for children, looking at challenges and opportunities in the context of COVID-19, and with a particular focus on global collaboration. So the We Protect Global Alliance is a global movement dedicated to putting online facilitated child sexual abuse and exploitation on the global agenda and mobilizing a worldwide campaign to end it. Government and law enforcement cannot tackle this crime in isolation. It is only through working in partnership with industry and civil society that we can work towards eradicating child sexual abuse online. We bring together the influence, expertise, and resources required to transform how online abuse is dealt with worldwide. The We Protect Global Alliance's geographical reach is unprecedented, as you can see from this slide. 98 countries are members, along with 46 private sector companies, 47 civil society organizations, and 9 international institutions. This diverse membership is key to our ability to deliver real change. A broad coalition of dedicated members is absolutely essential to our success. These statistics set out in stark relief why we need to act. Our last global threat assessment underlined how the scale, severity, and sophistication of the threat from child sexual abuse online have all increased. The National Society for Protection of Children in the UK underlined that it took, in an online world, only 45 seconds to groom a child so that abuse could be committed. In the times before the internet, this might have taken weeks, months, even years. So the scale is dramatically increasing. We also know that in streaming live abuse from the Philippines, this can cost only $15 to $20. That's down from $50 to $60 even 3 or 4 years ago. We are only starting to understand the scale and nature of the threat. The more we look, the more we find. And this means we need to ask sophisticated questions about what this data means. Does an increase in the number of referrals from technology companies necessarily mean an increase in the threat? It could reflect more active scanning from these companies. In fact, we think it would be a greater concern if numbers went down to 0. Putting this problem out of sight, out of mind is no longer acceptable. There is an underlying need for greater research and more data. In January, the UN Secretary General's Special Representative on Violence Against Children, Dr. Najat Mala-Majid, said that we must move out of silos and address all forms of violence against children. We can't divide sexual violence online and offline. Our vision and action must be broad and start with prevention. We couldn't agree more. Online harms do not stay on a screen. We care because they cause harm and trauma to real human beings, not pixels on a hard drive. Child sexual abuse online relates to other online harms, as you can see in this diagram, for example, cyberbullying, and to other forms of violence against children, women, and girls. We must set child sexual abuse online within its proper place within the wider ecosystem and ensure that we are learning from other forms of related harm. In 2017, a Swedish man was found guilty of serious sexual crimes over the internet against young girls in the USA, Canada, and Great Britain. The case was the first of its kind in Sweden, where a perpetrator was convicted of rape of children for activity that had taken place over the internet. Swedish research demonstrated the importance of viewing online child sexual abuse as a serious form of sexual abuse, even if the victim and perpetrator have not met outside the internet. For children in particular, they see their online and offline lives as a seamless whole. These are the digital natives who have never known a world without easy access to the internet. And that is affecting crimes against children. The UK Centre of Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse noted that online interaction is now so ubiquitous that it is likely to feature in almost all cases of child sexual abuse. But the centre also recognised that the online world has created new environments, providing perpetrators with opportunities and channels to facilitate child sexual abuse. This is a crime that unites the world in condemnation, and that is illegal in almost every territory. This offers us a clear imperative and avenue for action. Looking at challenges, our latest global threat assessment identified, as I have said, that the scale, sophistication, and severity of abuse were all increasing. This tsunami of cases is increasing the burden on every pillar of the We Protect Global Alliance: governments, law enforcement, civil society, and the private sector. The US National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported in February this year that 6.9 million reports received in 16.9 million reports received in 2019 grew to 21.7 million in 2020. That's up 28%. Messaging platforms remain the largest source. As internet connectivity grows, particularly in the global south, offenders are able to find and exploit new victims. This graphic underlines how the risks for child users of the internet change as they grow and become more confident online. We need to tailor our response so all of these are taken into account. And all of these trends have been intensified and accelerated by COVID-19. More potential victims and more potential offenders are coming online as the global population has adapted to pandemic restrictions and increased their online activity. In many cases, the pandemic has merely accelerated the move to online socialization or interaction. More screen time, less supervision, and greater vulnerability, coupled with networked groups of offenders, leads to greater risk. Interpol and Europol have both pointed to increases in live-streamed abuse, driven partly by economic hardship and a decrease in travel by sex offenders. There's also been an increase in self-generated indecent imagery, a risk of exploitation and misuse of material causing immense trauma to victims. Marginalized groups are at greatest risk. We have recently produced an assessment in partnership with Deaf Kids International, looking at the risks posed to deaf and disabled children by child sexual abuse online. We need to also note longer-term challenges. As resources become more scarce, as the global population deals with the impact of COVID-19, there may be less resources directed towards this crime. We need to ensure that it remains a priority for governments, companies, and civil society. But moving on to opportunities, the We Protect Global Alliance vision is a positive one. We are pro-internet. We want to see a world where children are able to take advantage of all the opportunities that the internet can offer in terms of learning, socialization, and play, without fear of sexual abuse or exploitation. This infographic shows the rapid increase of internet growth. These countries showed the fastest increases in 2018 to 2019. Most of them are also countries with very high youth populations. And this is not emphatically a problem confined to the global north. Children in countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are leapfrogging technology, potentially going straight from a radio to a smartphone in their pocket without the slow build-up of support services and technology that we've been able to see in the global north. There are huge benefits to be gained here in terms of learning, knowledge, and sheer fun. Can you imagine the challenges COVID-19 would have brought 20 or even 10 years ago? I am able to see how online connectivity has helped with my own family, where my daughters have been able to keep in contact with their friends, with their school, and to continue learning and playing under very trying circumstances. Another key opportunity are the tools we now have available to respond to this threat. There is now much greater awareness and political will than there was when We Protect Global Alliance began in the early 2010s. Using the expertise of our members, we have developed a model national response and a global strategic response framework. These are to be tailored and adapted by users. They underline the need for a holistic framework reflecting our two key foundational principles. This is a global crime that demands a global response, and no single entity can address the problem single-handed, no matter how large or powerful or wealthy it may be. We know we are at the tip of the iceberg. The aim is to bring this crime into the light. Rising report numbers are, as I said, in some ways a good thing. We would be more worried if we heard nothing. Harm grows in the shadows. And we know the faith community has a key role to play. It may be that someone asks you for guidance or discloses an incident of abuse. We know that the effects on victims and survivors can be lifelong. We know that it can take years for people to find the courage to come forward. There are resources available to support you to help. For example, on the End Violence Against Children website, eSafety Office of Australia, or ECPAT International. This can seem a huge problem, but talking, whether that be with your own children or with people in your community, is an important step forward. I just want to quickly close by highlighting our own priorities over the next year under our key objectives. Within collaboration, we hope to host roundtables dealing with some of the tough questions that arise from this issue. We have been working hard to upgrade our website to present more information and connect to more resources, and there'll be more updates on that coming up very soon. In terms of knowledge, we are currently working on the next iteration of our global threat assessment, which will be published in autumn this year. And we're looking particularly to focus on increasing the information that we've got coming in from the private sector and also from the global south. We're also carrying out, in partnership with UNICEF, a review of our model national response, which has now been in place for 5 years, and we want to analyze the evidence of how that has been used and try and make it better. And that will be looking at 60 countries worldwide, from low income to high income. On empowerment, we have a project working in partnership with ECPAT International, looking at the services that survivors are being able to access in two key territories. Eastern Europe, where we're looking at Bosnia and Herzegovina, Moldova and Albania, and Latin America, where we're looking at Mexico, Colombia, and Peru. We're looking to learn lessons from that and develop learning and plans to improve the response for victims and survivors of abuse. And then finally, around advocacy, we still hope to host a global summit in early 2022, ideally with the support of the Brazilian government. But we want to bring together our members to share knowledge, share experience, and develop a stronger response working together. I think, just to close, there's tremendous hope for the future. This is an area that has gone up the global agenda. There are tools, there's incredible work happening worldwide. It's now more important than ever that we bring our resources together, that we streamline our response, that we avoid duplication, and that we do our very best to support children to use and get the very best out of the internet without fear of abuse or exploitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your interest in our topic for this afternoon, which is Under the Radar: Global Minimum Estimates for Pandemic-Associated Orphanhood and Death of Caregivers in 2020. I would like to thank my collaborators, who include Dr. Andres Villaveses from the CDC and a large number of other co-authors from various institutions, including Imperial College of London, University College of London, the University of Oxford, Harvard, also from Maestro International and World Without Orphans, the World Bank, USAID, and WHO. Some of you may have seen articles that are in the press increasingly about the problem of COVID-19 associated deaths and the impact on orphans and their caregivers. The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Washington Post have covered this in the United States, and increasingly we are beginning to get news of the magnitude of this problem globally. The BBC, for example, aired a story in which the interviewer was spending time with a grandmother who was heading up an NGO and beginning to notice that the grandmothers in Zimbabwe, they were losing them to COVID. The background is, as you know, now in March, we have more than 100 million cases and more than 2.5 million deaths. And even though most deaths are among adults, this does not mean children are unaffected. In fact, many of the adults who are dying are parents of children, and these children end up being left without caregivers. We know that the loss of parents and caregivers increases a number of serious consequences for children: increased risk of mental health problems, suicide, violence against children, including sexual violence particularly, and as well as physical and emotional violence, economic hardships, infectious diseases, adolescent pregnancy, chronic diseases, and premature mortality. Early evidence on the COVID response and challenges suggests that parental and caregiver losses are having very serious impacts on children. And however, it is worrisome that adoption and foster care services have been quite strained, and in fact are less available than they had been before the pandemic. Also, the role of grandparents, who are more vulnerable to COVID-19, is achieving a prominent place because of their role in caring for children. In Brazil, for example, 70% of all children receive some support or care from grandparents. In the US, it's 40% of grandparents living with children serve as primary caregivers. In the UK, 40% of grandparents provide regular care for their grandchildren. And globally, we now know that 20% nearly of the population is grandparent age, often living in multi-generational households. Our goal was to provide a global minimum estimate of pandemic-associated orphanhood and caregiver deaths using data from 18 countries, and these countries together represented 77% of the global COVID deaths in 2020. For our methods, we estimated orphanhood and caregiver loss using excess mortality, COVID-19 associated mortality, and also by using the male and female fertility rates, which just is a measure of the average number of children a man and woman have during their reproductive years. And then using those estimates, we were able to calculate the number of orphans, minimum number of orphans that we estimated would have been created or would have been a consequence of the COVID pandemic. Our methods for measuring the loss of co-resident grandparents who are typically providing some type of care, whether it's emotional or psychosocial or relational, or just their presence in the influence in the family, literal care by feeding, clothing, dressing, mentoring, supervising, or financial support. Usually they provide some type of care. We wanted to measure the prevalence of skip generation grandparents over age 60. Those are defined as living with grandchildren in the absence of the parents, and also the prevalence of grandparents and other possible caregivers over age 60 living with a young household member ages 0 to 19. Then we use these estimates from the 18 countries to extrapolate global estimates for the numbers of children orphaned or losing their parents, their grandparents, or caregivers. Here you see the minimum estimates of children who were impacted by COVID-associated deaths of the parents or caregivers. And what's really worrisome here, you see in the circles all the countries who during only the first 10 months of the pandemic saw more than 60,000 newly orphaned children created. If we look at country estimates by region for rates per 1,000 children, we see that in Europe, it's more than, we have Russia and Spain having more than 1 out of every 1,000 children in the countries. For the Americas, it was essentially all the countries have more than 1 out of every 1,000 children. Africa has been not as hard hit previously, even though that is really changing recently, but South Africa has borne the hardest brunt of all, with nearly 4 of every 1,000 children having experienced death of a parent or a grandparent caregiver who lives in their own home as a consequence of COVID-associated mortality. And in the Eastern Mediterranean, we see high rates in Iran. So summing up all these numbers that you saw on the map previously for and projecting the global extrapolation for every country in the world, we see an invisible pandemic before us. The 1.8 million COVID-associated deaths are linked to 1.1 million children newly orphaned or having lost their grandparents or caregivers as a consequence of COVID. And we're really disturbed because of what we are seeing here in the early stages of the pandemic. It took 4 months for us to see 500,000 deaths from March to June. Then it only took an additional 3 months for that 500,000 deaths to double and become 1.1 million. Then it only took an additional 2 months or 60 days for that initial 500,000 to triple and become 1.5 million. And then it took only 45 days for that initial number to quadruple and become 2 million. We are quite disturbed by how rapidly the numbers of deaths are increasing and the numbers of children orphaned or having lost their caregivers is increasing. So here we see what happened when we extended beyond the first 10 months of the pandemic in 2020 into the first 5 months of the next 5 months of the pandemic in 21. And we think of this as doubling the danger in half the time. You basically had the same number of deaths and orphans in the first 5 months of 2021 using projection data to the end of May as we had in the first 10 months of 2020. So altogether then, by the end of May, we will anticipate there will already be 3.6 million deaths and 2.2 million children who have been orphaned or lost caregivers as a consequence of this pandemic. Currently, the situation we are in is that due to COVID-19, every 12 seconds, one child is orphaned or faces the death of a grandparent or caregiver due to COVID-19. There's a lot of global urgency here. We see the graph on the left depicts age-based distribution of cases of COVID, and we see many of them are in the young adult population, that is the parental age 20 to 55, for example. However, the majority of the deaths occur in the older populations, particularly 60 and above. However, these deaths occurring in these older ages do not suggest that children are left unaffected, because for every death of one of these persons in one of these older age brackets, typically there is a child or grandchild affected. We have a clear call to action for children facing COVID-19 associated orphanhood and vulnerability that is intimately linked to the theme of this conference, preventing and responding to sexual violence. We really believe the data are clear. We have to rapidly accelerate prevention of death of these grandparent caregivers and parent caregivers by supporting vaccine equity and public health prevention through appropriate mitigation. We also believe that it's clear that we need to prepare families and communities to support kinship fostering or adoption for children at risk of being separated from their families and in need of alternative care. And finally, we need to really strengthen our evidence-based responses that support protecting children from violence and abuse, particularly supporting evidence-based interventions that strengthen positive parenting, economic support, and educational growth. So let's look at the first of these, preventing orphanhood and loss of caregivers in the first place by promoting vaccine equity. You see here on this picture, this same grandmother being interviewed by the journalist from BBC who asked her what could be done to help the grandmothers. And she said, we need a vaccine for every grandmother. And when I present this and men are in the audience, they're very quick to say, and grandfathers, and we would certainly agree for every grandmother and grandfather, and in fact, any parents. This map is quite concerning, produced by the Economist Intelligence Unit. You see in blue here the countries that should be receiving the vaccine in large quantities over the next 12 months. And you see in purple the countries that will not begin to receive substantive numbers of vaccine doses until a year from now on into the end of 2023. And when we see how rapidly this orphan population is escalating, we see even more clearly how urgently we need to rapidly advance vaccine equity throughout the world so that the colors in this map begin to blend and become the same. So we also want to prepare children who need family-based alternative care by supporting kinship, fostering, adopting. We really need to be sure that at all costs institutions are avoided. We know that institutional care increases the risk of sexual abuse for children. And finally, we want to support evidence-based approaches that strengthen positive parenting, economic growth, and educational growth, which you've heard a lot about those evidence-based approaches, particularly from the PEPFAR colleagues who have spoken, and also from those who have spoken from WHO and CDC on the INSPIRE package. And you see clearly that we can increase the number of children that are protected from all abuse, including sexual abuse, by 51% if these three interventions are implemented together. That's the end of my presentation, and I really want to close by emphasizing the role of faith-based leaders is critical in this entire response because they are the ones who often are the first to know when a child has been orphaned because of COVID. They're the ones actually providing the funerals and the memorial service leadership and burials. They're overseeing those as gatekeepers in the communities. And they would be the first to know when there are children in the home that are now vulnerable because of the death of a parent or grandparent caregiver. Thank you very much for your attention.